Welcome, everyone, to this week's Academy for International Cooperation special event where we're doing something a little bit different. Typically, we've had peace roundtables featuring a multitude of speakers. Today, we are blessed with Scott Horton, who has been somebody on our radar, especially Ed Lizansky has been a follower and an admirer of Scott's analysis. For those who may not know, I think everyone here is pretty familiar with Scott's work, but if you don't, if you're not aware, Scott is the author of Provoked: How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine. It's a fantastic opus, a giant book that really lays out very uncomfortable truths that too many have been trying to ignore and can no longer ignore, especially with the very interesting new developments that are being forced upon the world through the new administration and a lot of points of optimism. And so we're going to listen to some of Scott's considerations. He's also the author or the host of Antiwar Radio on 90.7 FM KPFK LA in Los Angeles, and the host of the Scott Horton Show. All of those links will be in the description box under this video. So without further ado, Ed has a few thoughts as well to share, and we're going to do like usual. We're going to listen to Scott develop his ideas in a formal manner, and then we're going to open up for some dialogue with the audience. So Ed, go for it.
Well, Matt, first of all, please don't forget to mention American University in Moscow. So it's a joint project. and as far as Scott presentation, it's a perfect timing. Perfect timing when we finally are getting some hope. Of course, we'll hear if Scott has some hopes too. But in preparation for his presentation, I wrote several articles. And by the way, one of the sites which I publish regularly, it's called Pluralia. It's Italian site, and they translated in 4 languages simultaneously: Italian, Russian, English, and Chinese. And now they're adding Arabic. And I wrote several articles promoting this book. So now it's also, hopefully some Chinese people read it as well. But also somehow I ended up on Republican mailing lists. And I'm getting every day like maybe 10, 15 letters from Trump down below, and also Keith Kellogg. And I respond always, I don't know if they read my reply, but I respond them, read this book, especially in preparation. You know that tomorrow, probably day after tomorrow, the first real meeting will be in Saudi Arabia about ending this war. And I sent it also a copy to Republican National Committee here in Washington. So I did my best to promote it. And now let's hear what Scott has to say.
Hi. Well, thank you very much, Ed, and everybody for having me here. It's really great. I will try, and this is the kiss of death. It never works, but I'll try to keep my remarks brief so I can have as much time as possible for questions, since I know that this audience that's very educated on this subject and will already, have a lot to say about it. So I'm here for that. I'm writing a note to myself to ask you later, Ed, about my anecdote that I write about you in the book and H.W. Bush back at the start of the book there. If you could tell that story, but maybe we'll wait and start the question and answer period with that. So I do have what Biden's got going on too, so I'm writing a note to myself so I don't forget. I think probably most people in this audience understand the basic thrust of the argument on probably most of these points. The same as my terror war book that I wrote, Enough Already, before. There's not too much like, top secret stuff or things that educated people don't really know about in there. I think my advantage is I try to tell long stories where I make the connection about how one error led to the next and led to the next. It's really kind of basic libertarian economic analysis applied to foreign policy, in a sense. Government interventions causing, malinvestments in the marketplace, let's say, propping up a group of people in power in Afghanistan for 20 years, for example, who then when we stop pumping money into their company, it crashes right out of the market and is replaced by the people who would much more naturally have the power there, for example. Not that Bill Clinton didn't help put the Taliban in power in the first place in 1996, but that's a separate story. But anyway, so that's basically what I bring to the table, I hope, is just sorry, I don't know what this thing is doing. Is telling a long story in a row. So I try to tell you in the book, and it's just in chronological order. The chapters are the presidents, and it's what H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, W. Bush, and the rest all the way through have done really to botch America's relationship with Russia in the post-Cold War era. And as I say in the subtitle there, not just the war in Ukraine, but started the new Cold War with Russia and the catastrophe in Ukraine. And there have been plenty of chances for resets through the years, and they always seem to get blown. The book does not make the case that the Russian government is innocent in any or all of this. And the title is Provoked, not Justified. I don't think that the Russians were left with no option but to invade. But that wasn't really the question. The claim by our government was that evil did this because good wasn't strong enough to resist them or something. And so that's how this started, as all of their morality tales go. And that's not true. So that's basically the story. And then the bullet points of it are basically that Bush Sr. had promised not only to not, and I know this has been supposedly debunked, but I rebunk it in the book and demonstrate clearly that there were multiple promises not to expand NATO, and that the agreement of the Soviets to allow reunification of Germany was based on those promises, but that they never meant them, and that the plan all along was to expand NATO and to make sure to maintain American dominance in Europe indefinitely, and even to expand NATO into the East. That was the plan from the beginning. But they told the Soviets and then the Russians that, no, actually, we're going to make NATO into a political organization. So even if it were to expand, it wouldn't even matter anyway, because it'll be sort of like the EU plus NATO. I mean, pardon me, the EU plus America. But we're going to replace the alliance with a new partnership. There's no enemy, so we don't need an alliance. We're going to use the CSCE, or later under the Clinton years, they said the Partnership for Peace. And under these organizations, the former of which the Soviet Union and then Russia were already members of, and the latter of which was proposed and created and explained that it would include the Russians, the Ukrainians, Belarus, and even the Stans, and everyone would be part of it all from the beginning, so that for one thing, as they said explicitly at the time, Ukraine's neutrality would be baked in, and there wouldn't be a contest over these countries right on Russia's border, because they would be part of the same group with us. But the problem with that, of course, was that America would have had to share too much power, too much decision-making authority with the Russians, and they weren't willing to do that. So even though they talked a big game about erasing the dividing lines in Europe, they just redrew them. They moved them further east, but they kept the Russians on the outside. And it's the case, as a lot of people know, that Gorbachev and Yeltsin and Putin asked repeatedly to be able to join NATO themselves in order to make these controversies moot. And the Americans, essentially, it became a tradition to just simply ignore them and just ask another question on another subject and not even discuss it with them. And Clinton himself mocked the NATO-Russia Council and the founding act that created it in 1997 as a joke. His friends quoted him in his own words saying, "Oh yeah, let me get this straight. This is the deal until we wake up in the morning and decide it's not anymore." And this kind of thing. And that was their attitude. As Bill Clinton's Secretary of Defense, William Perry, wrote that he blamed the American side for the deterioration of the relationship in the post-Cold War era. And by the way, he was not some kind of Democratic partisan Dennis Kucinich type. He was a wonk, engineer, scientist, brainiac from the bowels of the Pentagon who rose up to be Secretary of Defense, was essentially where he was coming from with this. And he, in fact, blamed himself personally and said, people try to tell me it's not my fault, but yes, it is. I accept responsibility for it. I could have, should have done more to stop them. And including, I could have even resigned over it, over NATO expansion, over Russia's dead body, basically. And they would say to themselves and each other, yeah, but what are they going to do about it? The Soviet Union was strong, Russia's not. So at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what they want or what they think. We don't have to take their considerations into account. And then, as Perry said, guess what? The Russians picked up on that was the Americans' attitude, was of this kind of contempt. And so it wasn't just all the actions that they were taking, but it was the overall insult added to injury as well. And then so there's shock therapy, of course, with the economic policy in the 1990s, which I make the case in the book that the problem there was not that they moved too quickly to capitalism, but that they didn't, and that they didn't have the Americans who helped. They were not libertarians. They were what we call neoliberals, right? They were not even from, certainly not the Austrian school, and not even from the Chicago school. They were from Harvard and USAID. And basically what they did was they just hooked up the people who could speak English, right? Like the guys that they knew, and just made cronies out of them and helped completely gangsterize and corrupt the Russian economy. When what they really needed, first and foremost, was a strict rule of law protecting property rights and contracts that would be strictly and ruthlessly enforced. And they needed to fire the commie head of the central bank who wouldn't stop printing money, which was a huge problem and was something that they never got control over. So again, there were plenty of Russians involved in their own corruption there, but there were plenty of Americans too. And it's not even necessarily an accusation for me, because in the book, all I do is quote them admitting it and taking responsibility for it and saying that they're sorry, that they really did help turn the Russian economy over to 7 murderer gangsters in the 1990s. And that was what the Russian people tolerated, a strong man like Putin, who actually came from those corrupt ranks, but then pulled absolute rank alpha dog as soon after he came to power, and kept the oligarchs who fell in line and got rid of the rest. And people supported him in that because of what a disaster the Americans had helped to cause to the Russian economy. Then there's the Balkan Wars, which I'll skip, but they were both at the expense of the Russians' friends, the Serbs, and over their dead body in terms of all the international law and international organizations that are supposed to be involved. They had to essentially lie to them in Bosnia and go around the United Nations entirely in the case of the Kosovo War in 1999. And when W. Bush comes in and the terror war begins, Vladimir Putin's the first one who calls him on September 11th and says, let's take this opportunity. You know, Putin's new and Bush is new. So forget the 90s. It's the new millennium. And we got a common enemy in these bin Ladenites. So let's work together to get them. I'll help you invade Afghanistan, he says. And Bush takes him up on that. But then just a couple of months later, he tears up the anti-ballistic missile treaty, which was really important. And I guess I'll talk more about that in a minute. But in effect, when he did that, it also killed the START II treaty, which both sides were negotiating. And START II would have banned all multiple independent re-entry vehicles. So that might have made these decisions the worst ones humans have ever made. I guess time will tell. But and then W. Bush also picked up where Clinton left off with this. And this goes back to the old Cold War years, of course, as well. But Bill Clinton had continued American regime change against Russian friends in what were called the color-coded revolutions. And they started in Slovakia in 98, and then they went to Croatia in 99, almost certainly in 99, but Tudjman died right before the election anyway. But anyway, and then they did the bulldozer revolution in 2000 in Serbia after the war to depose Milosevic. Then they did the Rose Revolution in 2003 in Georgia, the first coup d'etat dressed up as a revolution in Ukraine in 2004, the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan in 2005, also the failed Denim Revolution in Belarus in 2005, which of course is a crucial ally to Moscow and absolutely was regarded as a national security threat by them. And then the Cedar Revolution in Lebanon, which failed to overthrow the regime, but did, I guess, seemingly help lead to the ouster of the Syrians from southern Lebanon at that time. But these are almost all essentially done at the expense of the Russians. And then Bush, and of course, the Iraq War and all the destabilization that came from that, has sort of a bit part in this story. And then worst of all was the as I mentioned, he tore up the anti-ballistic missile treaty, and he moved or began to install anti-ballistic missile systems, essentially the Navy's Aegis radar and anti-ballistic missile systems onshore, what they call Aegis onshore. And this is in Poland and Romania with the radars in the Czech Republic. And the thing about this is it's very controversial because first of all, they're kind of violating the spirit of the Founding Act, where they promised not to move substantial forces into the new NATO countries in 1997, and just ignore that just a few years later. And then the thing of it is, and they are violating that, and also the spirit of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, Reagan's great achievement from '87, which banned all short and medium range nuclear missiles from Europe. And because the launchers themselves, it's called the Mark 41 or the MK-41 missile launcher, can hold Tomahawk cruise missiles, not just Sparrow missile interceptors, but cruise missiles that can be tipped with hydrogen bombs. And they did this without any agreement with the Russians for inspection. All you have to do is have some captain whose job it is to sit there and make sure that nobody's putting Tomahawks in the thing. It's no problem at all to do. But they would not, dignify Russian paranoia. We told you it's defensive and that'll be good enough for you. And so not even the simplest inspection regime would be tolerated there. And when, of course, they claim they're trying to intercept missiles that Iran might be shooting at Poland, that doesn't make any sense. So it seems like it's part of a first strike capability. And W. Bush said, Vlad, we obviously can't shoot down incoming rockets. You guys have far enough, rockets to devastate Europe that we could never shoot down with the pitiful amount of interceptors we have here. So you can't believe that it's part of a first strike capability. And he said, that's a good point, W. Bush. Maybe it's not being able to shoot down all of our retaliatory capability from there. Maybe it's just about getting a sneak first strike on Moscow with a Tomahawk cruise missile before we could defend against it by moving your system so close here in these dual-use launchers. And this is the kind of thing that drives absolute paranoia. And the Americans, just all the way through, especially, I guess, starting in Clinton, and all the way through, they just say, it's defensive. And then that'll just be good enough. But we know now from recent history, the Russians embarked then on a massive new expansion of their nuclear arsenal, including a whole new generation of heavy weapons and multiple independently targetable reentry vehicles, supposedly a nuclear-powered cruise missile with virtually unlimited range, nuclear torpedoes, and, of course, their hypersonics. Because Putin said, well, let's see, I can try to match you with interceptors, which are extremely expensive and difficult to operate, or I can just make more offensive weapons to counter your new defensive capability. That's cheaper. So I'll just do that. And then he announced, and this is a direct reaction to W. Bush, he announced his new generation of nukes in 2018. And Bush, of course, also essentially, helped to tear up the rest of well, never mind that, but he announced the Bucharest Declaration 2008, which despite, and we know this from the memoirs or whatever, I cite it in the book, the ambassador to Moscow and his entire staff, the CIA, the National Security Council, and the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense all were against it, and presumably all told him that. I don't know that Rice and Gates advised against it, but I know that Burns said that he thought Rice agreed with him. That's the best we got on her, I think. But we know Gates slammed him in his book later, the Secretary of Defense. I don't know if he had the courage to say anything to W. Bush himself about it. But they all opposed Bush's move to announce that he wanted to bring Georgia and Ukraine into NATO. And we know why he did it. It's Burns says in his book, and there are other sources too, it was what they called legacy building for W. Bush. This is what libertarians call public choice theory. It means there's no national interest. There's just the interest of the individual bum who has to be sitting in the chair and deciding what he wants to do for himself. So W. Bush his legacy was supposed to be bringing democracy to the Middle East. Yeah, well, that didn't work out too well. So then he moved on to he was going to privatize Social Security and put it in the stock market bubble, the same one that crashed in September of '08 before he could leave office. But they wouldn't let him do that. So his legacy was nothing. All the historians ranked him as one of the lowest presidents in all of American history. So he had to do something big and important for himself. And so he announced he was going to bring Georgia and Ukraine into the NATO alliance. And even though they didn't really give them a membership action plan, he insisted on announcing that it was going to happen soon enough anyway. And all the policies that were under his direct control, like expanding interoperability under their previous agreements to work together and so forth, would all be expanded. And look, the reason that all those Americans, all those officials opposed this, it's the same reason that Francois Hollande and Angela Merkel opposed this. There was only one reason that any of them ever cited. It wasn't this, it was expensive. It was that it was an unnecessary provocation against the Russians. It's going to cause a major problem, and it's just not worth it. And there were some who thought that that Germany's budding commercial relationship with Russia was such a problem we had to do something about it. We don't want them importing Russian gas. We want them importing Texas gas or whatever it was that they had in mind there. But they just thought this was all going too far. It's going to cause a terrible reaction. And of course, just a couple months later, it led to the war in Georgia. And now Saakashvili started that war seemingly to settle his borders, because you can't join NATO if you don't have settled borders. The other side of the story is that the Russians provoked it by escalating their sort of tit for tat little, very minor artillery war that was going on, a few shells a day kind of thing leading up to it. And in order to disrupt their ability to join. Either way is W. Bush's fault for instigating the thing. And once the war broke out, Dick Cheney advised that Bush strike the Russians coming through the Rocky Tunnel under the Caucasus Mountains, which Bush thankfully ignored. But we could have gone to war with Russia right then as a virtually direct result of the Bucharest Declaration right then and there. Then Obama comes in and he does a lot of horrible things, including his government does the so-called snow revolution, backing, USAID and NED backed, Soros backed NGOs doing sort of a very half-assed color-coded type revolution supporting dissident groups in Russia, which of course could never work and would only serve to stick a splinter under Putin's thumbnail, right, and make him angry, but actually accomplish nothing other than that in creating a backlash there. They did the war in Libya where, Putin, for a strong man, and he is a strong man, but he stepped aside. And everybody knew he was the real power behind the throne, but still he obeyed the law on term limits and stepped aside and became prime minister for a while and allowed his deputy, Medvedev, to take power. And then what does America do? Completely humiliate the jerk and trick him into signing on to or at least abstaining from a UN vote on allowing the war in Libya, which they claimed was to protect the poorer civilians of Benghazi with a no-fly zone, and then immediately turn into a 9-month NATO regime change operation. Don't worry, purely defensive NATO, the defensive alliance, they claim, as they launch another aggressive war. And in defiance of the thing, but they made a sucker out of Medvedev and helped weaken him and helped convince Putin. There are anecdotes about this, that this helped convince Putin that he better come back to power sooner, not later. Poor old Russia can't get along without him, obviously. And yeah, I guess other people were made to feel that way as well. And so he came back possibly even sooner than expected. And hell, he might have just let his deputies run with it if they were going to do a good job, but they didn't. And that was on the Americans for deceiving them there. Now, and then, of course, worse was the so-called Revolution of Dignity. And I have a ton on that. I guess I won't elaborate too much. Everyone here, I'm sure, understands the story, is that this was a coup dressed up as a revolution. And when I say coup, I don't want to oversimplify this, because, in fact, a lot of people oversimplify this, and I've been guilty of oversimplifying this myself. So I should stipulate here that I consider the Americans and the Europeans forcing Yanukovych under sanctions and threats of worse to accept their choice for prime minister, to essentially dismiss his government and accept their demands for who should run his government from now on, and to stand for early elections before his term is up, to be a coup de something. And I don't speak French, but I asked the AI bot, and they said that there's like 10 different kinds of coup de somethings in French, and not including coup de grace, because that's different, but just there's and not including coup de main. Well, nah, because that's like a foreign state, right? But they had coup de judiciary and coup de parliamentary shenanigans and coup de George Soros spent $100 million on the thing and coup de Joe Biden authorized us to glue and midwife and stick this transition. And so that's what it is. And you can call it what you want specifically, but in reality, and we should all stipulate this so that people don't understand, when the Americans and the Europeans forced the deal through that Yanukovych agreed to, first of all, Vladimir Putin made him sign it. He got on the phone and the Russian president told him, sign the deal. And he said, yes, sir, sir. And then when the protest leaders brought it to the protesters, they said no. And a guy named Parasyuk, who is admitted, and I have all the footnotes in the book, the BBC, the Frankfurter Allgemeiner, and BNE and Telenews, they all identified this man, Parasyuk, as the leader of the snipers from the Music Conservatory the morning before. The same guy, a neo-Nazi leader of the 100. He ran up on the stage and grabbed the mic away from the protest leaders and said, we reject this deal. Any deal that doesn't include the removal of the president is null and void. And while he's up there yelling, he says, and if he's not gone by 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, I'm going to kill him myself. And the New York Times and the others concede and reported the same thing at the time that day. And so part of the deal was he pulled his police back. And once he started to pull them back, I guess they all just abandoned their posts and got on buses and got the hell out of there. And so they didn't have to kill him. He ran. And the Nazis who were leading the protest movement, they completed what's really called a putsch. I think that one's German. Which is, a bunch of street toughs. They're the ones who really overthrew the government in the final step. And I don't know of anyone who ever said that the CIA made them do it or that there was that level of control. But it was just, as I said, the Americans and the Europeans were forcing through this deal. But the whole thing by then had just completely come to a head. And it wasn't going to stand. And once he ordered his security forces back, that was essentially all he wrote there. So it was a somewhat complicated story, but the bottom line is none of it could have ever happened if the American government and its closely allied so-called NGOs hadn't spent $100 million or more on the project to do it. And then that led to the war in the East because, and a lot of people don't know this, but I have lots of footnotes for it if anyone wants to check, including, I guess, the original documents, where the previous presidents, Kravchuk, Kuchma, and Yushchenko, all wrote a letter saying now is the time we must cancel the Kharkiv agreement and kick the Russians out of the Sevastopol naval base. And it was only then that the Marines and the sailors seized the peninsula. This one's called the coup de main. One big successful surprise attack. Only 6 people were killed, 2 soldiers, 2 civilians on the Ukrainian side, and 2 Russian soldiers were killed in the entire thing. And they took it. But I think this is part of what really led to the war in the East, was because when the protesters, and there were some, Russian nationals involved and whatever, but it was a very few identifiable men. But there was a mass movement that seized these buildings and said, well, if you guys could seize buildings and overthrow the government, we can seize buildings and refuse to respect your new authority. And they overreacted and launched a massive war. And we know that John Brennan came to town on April the 12th, and they launched the war on the 14th. And USA Today and Forbes magazine both said he had given them orders to launch this war. And it was, I believe, an overreaction on the part of the Americans and the new junta in Kiev after what had happened in Crimea. They weren't going to let that happen again. And so as the new president, it was a brand new president, Poroshenko, was making the change of power right then, said, it'll just take a few days. We'll just go in there and roust these bandits out. And of course, it didn't just take a few days. And a huge part of the army defected to the other side, and it turned into a horrible war. And then they had a peace deal. It was insane that this is, at this time, American and European policies, to keep pushing it and keep pushing it and keep supporting it until the Russians did finally intervene in August of 2014 that forced Kiev to the deal. And Angela Merkel really forced them to the table to sign the Minsk deal, and which was essentially not complete enough. So they went back and revised it after another major defeat at Debaltseve in February of 2015. And that was what led to sort of the status quo, where I believe it was approximately 9,000 people had died in that first almost year of fighting. and then another, say, 4,000 people, mostly fighters, but also civilians on both sides killed in the meantime. And this was one of the major reasons for the outbreak of war in 22, was that still unresolved conflict. Now, I'll skip Donald Trump, except to say that Russiagate was an entire hoax. I have 75 pages on it. Not one lick of it was true. And I put it all in context there, that a big part of it, well, there are a lot of reasons for it, but part of it was Trump had openly said he wanted another reset with Russia, which is the same thing Obama said and the same thing that Bush said. But when Trump said it, it was just intolerable. I guess they thought he really meant it. But Trump, you know, he was being honest when he said, look, he never was a peacenik, a Ron Paul non-interventionist. He said, listen, I talked with Henry Kissinger, and Henry Kissinger said, you're so smart, Donald Trump. That's exactly right. We want to make friends with Russia so that we can use them against China, or at least deprive China of them as an ally. This is all great power competition, but their European Christian civilization, we ought to be bringing them closer, not kicking them further away toward the east and toward their old ally from the Cold War days before our side had wisely split them 50 years ago at the beginning of the 1970s. And really, the Sino-Soviet split had already existed, but the Americans finally came and that realization, took advantage of it in the Nixon years there. And so why would we reverse that? And Kissinger said, look, back then we were separating the weaker power from the stronger, China from the Soviet Union. Now we need to be doing the same thing again, separating Russia from China and keeping them with us. And so Trump was just agreeing with that. But the ball was already rolling on Russiagate by then anyway. So, of course, they just blew it up like crazy. And there's a great quote in the New York Times. Keith Gesson wrote The Quiet Americans. And there's a quote in there where I'm almost certain it was Trump's own staff who said, Trump is like the captain of a ship. He's holding the wheel, but it's not attached to anything. Meaning the fourth branch of government, the executive branch, not the fourth branches in the media. That's the wrong turn of phrase. Sorry. But the permanent state, the permanent Article 2 state, the one that he's in such conflict with right now, that they just do what they want. We saw this during the Ukraine Gate impeachment, where it was his own White House turned on him. His own National Security Council turned on him. And if you read the testimony of Alexander Vindman, the colonel who really got this started, a lieutenant colonel on the NSC staff who got this started, he is just, and he wrote this in The Atlantic as well, he's just incredulous that Donald Trump thought that he had the right to change American foreign policy. Who the hell does this guy, Donald Trump, the elected president, think he is? Just because he's the one who gets to sit in the chair behind the Resolute desk, that means that he thinks he gets to tell us what to do? No. We, the U.S. government, we have a policy concerning Russia, and we have a policy concerning Ukraine. And the interagency has met and decided. And so who in the hell does the elected president think he is to tell us no, that he wants to go a different direction? He does not have that right. In fact, that's criminal. In fact, I'm telling on him and getting him in trouble for this. He has no right. And it's in his own words. And that's truly, represented and reflected the spirit of the government. And you could blame the fact on Donald Trump that these people work down the hall from him and he doesn't know who they are, that they hate his guts and mean to overturn his every policy. He's the boss. So that part's his fault. But he did increase weapons. He was convinced to increase weapons. Obama did send some, but Trump increased it. And he also refused to implement or refused to order his government to implement the Minsk II deal and come to any kind of final resolution. And you kind of can't blame him. I mean, he was absolutely hemmed in and reined in through at least 2019 anyway. And it was very difficult. I don't know if he even knows that his ambassador, William Taylor, helped ruin a peace plan that was put forward by the German foreign minister called the Steinmeier Formula, which essentially reordered the order of implementation of the Minsk II deal to attempt to make it acceptable to both sides. And Ambassador William Taylor told Poroshenko, don't sign it. Oh, no, pardon me, Zelensky. This is when Zelensky was brand new. Told Zelensky, don't sign it. It's a bad deal. And even Steinmeier doesn't know what it is or whatever. This is just how Ambassador Zimmerman helped make the war in Bosnia this much worse back in 1992. when he helped to destroy the Lisbon deal, which was already struck and already signed. He said you should unsign it. It's the same kind of thing here. Don't go along with this implementation of the peace deal you've already signed. And so, in other words, Trump might as well not have been the president of Russia policy for his first term. He certainly did not seem to get his way on virtually anything. And then the history of 2021 is, I believe that, I mean, others have reported this, and I think that this seems right to me, that the final straw for Putin was the seizing of his friend Medvedchuk's media companies and properties in March of 2021. This is a guy who's very close to Putin. Putin is his daughter's godfather, I believe it is. Yeah. And you know, he was, you know, whatever, powerful, corrupt oligarch, whatever, tied to Moscow, and his TV station represented Russia's point of view there. And the Biden administration cheered him on when Zelensky seized this guy's properties and I think put him under house arrest and all this. It was shortly after that that Putin started moving his forces toward Ukraine's borders. And then in July, he met with Biden and I guess must have decided there that this is going to be easy because this old coot is absolutely out of his mind and I'll be able to walk right over him. And then, of course, they completely botched the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which just made the Biden administration look like the worst incompetent idiots in the world, which is probably true and probably emboldened the Russians a bit more as well. But then in September and October, the State Department and the Defense Department reiterated all of their big talk about how they're going to bring Ukraine into NATO and increase military interoperability with their forces. What that means in practice, people, is that if NATO and the Russian Federation go to war, that even though Ukraine would not be a full-fledged ally with Article 5 protection, their military would be just another auxiliary army under NATO command, just like the rest of them. That's what that means. Interoperability means giving them our radios, our guns, our weapons, our calibers, our artillery launchers, our tanks, our, you know, whatever, command and control authorities, so that they can be suborned into our fight if we ever get in a fight with the Russian Federation. That's what it all meant. And if they thought this was going to make the Russians change their mind and back down, they're crazy, right? They're just, in other words, like if it's a bar fight, they're just pushing them in the chest, which is saying like, I dare you to hit me, right? Is essentially what they're doing. Maybe they're pushing their friend into into his enemy. And then in December, Putin's government proposed a new treaty, and the Washington Post and New York Times would have everyone believe that, oh, these were insane demands and offer we couldn't possibly accept, or whatever. That's not true. Now, America did that in Serbia, for example, the Rambouillet Accord, a peace treaty that's made to be rejected, but this was not. And I had it on very good authority. In fact, including administration officials did admit off the record to the Post and the Times, but also had it from Chas Freeman, who had gone to China with Nixon, had been the ambassador to Saudi Arabia and other important countries in the past, had been named to be chair of the National Intelligence Council under Obama before the Israel lobby stopped him, but is widely considered to be a wise old graybeard foreign policy hand and analyst. And he told me that these treaties, obviously, we would not just sign them on the dotted line at the bottom, but that's not what they were for. They're for sitting down at a table and negotiating over. And taking seriously. But the Americans would not negotiate in good faith. Their policy clearly was to tell Putin, you better not do it. Because if you do, we're going to give them a bunch of guns and we're going to make it tough for you. We're going to back an Afghan-style insurgency against you for the long term. The assumption was that the Ukrainian military would crumble almost immediately and that America would be backing a stay-behind force of right-wing militias essentially against them in the west of the country, something like that. And so they were warning Putin, don't you do it. But then they wouldn't negotiate in good faith. And a great example of this is their phone call on December 30th. Biden told Vladimir Putin that, listen, we're not going to bring Ukraine into NATO, and we're not going to put missiles in Kharkiv either. I don't know why you're worried about that, but we're really not going to do that. And Putin said, all right, we'll put it in writing then. I mean, not that that really means anything, but it might as well try it. And Biden said, okay, we can negotiate that. But then he did not do that. And part of this is because he's an 80-something-year-old senile old man who just could not control his government. He is incapable of following up with his staff 2 days later and saying, hey, we're doing that, right? Or anything like that. So they just do what they want, and they did not want to do that. They refused. They absolutely refused to discuss. They actually said, oh, yeah, we're going to have this meeting. And then they didn't even show up for the meeting. And it was like a third level down meeting about whether they're going to put these missiles in Kharkiv, which I believe Biden that he never meant to put these type of missile systems in Kharkiv. This was what Putin was stating that he was afraid of, that if America went so far as to bring Ukraine into NATO, hell, they could put these missiles like they have in Poland. They could put them right in Kharkiv. Then what would we do? So that was where this was coming from, was like Putin's hypothetical about the ultimate extent of the potential danger here. And so it's totally believable that Biden had no intention of doing that, but he had no intention of writing it in a treaty and promising not to. And the same with NATO membership. He said, we can't, he said this in other circumstances too, that we can't bring them in. And in the other circumstances, he explained part of it is because of the fact that Ukrainian democracy and the Ukrainian so-called capitalist economy is so corrupt that they can never abide by all the rules of EU membership and NATO membership. It's just too much and too chaotic and too destabilizing. And of course, they have their ongoing border dispute, which the NATO agreement says you can't bring in new countries that have an ongoing border dispute. That would then make the alliance liable for the entire dispute. And this is actually something that Putin raised numerous times, was that, listen, as he put it, Crimea belongs to Russia, always did, now certainly does again, but Ukraine doesn't accept that, and the United States and the allies do not accept that, and they continue to insist that Crimea belongs to Ukraine and the Russians are illegally occupying it. Well, what does that mean? That means if Ukraine attacked Russian forces in Crimea, and I say I'm defending myself, they're going to say that they're defending themselves against my defense, and that I'm the one who's aggressing. And then what does that mean? That means war between the Russian Federation and NATO. Is that what you want? Which was a potential danger, right? He was right about that. You have this insane contest, and which, by the way, not insane, but just stupid, essentially, pretended claim that somehow Russia's going away and that Crimea will somehow revert to Ukrainian sovereignty, or should in principle forever, or something. Like it's the Baltics during the Cold War, and that like one day Latvia will be free or whatever. No, Crimea has belonged to Russia since 1873, right? Since America was the same year that America was signing, 1783 is what I meant to say. What did I say? 1783, the same year America was signing the peace treaty with Britain to end the Revolutionary War, 4 years before our Constitution was even written. And so, no, it's not going back to Ukraine. And certainly not with that naval base. Putin joked that, yeah, it'd be fun. It'd be really nice to go visit our NATO friends down at the Sevastopol naval base. But you know what would be better is if we keep the base and you just come and visit us. That'll be great. Okay, let's do that. So that was the contest that the Americans essentially put the Ukrainians in the position of losing. And in closing, and I'm sorry, I go on too long about these were supposed to be bullet points and questions, right? To wrap up here, they would have, could have, should have known, the Biden administration, that what they were doing would start a war. They were warned by their own CIA that their calibration was off. You keep pouring these weapons in. The idea is that it will deter Russia, but it won't. In fact, it's provoking them. It's making war more likely because they're deciding that if they're going to go to war with Ukraine eventually, because of the circumstances, then they better do it now, not later, when they're more heavily armed and it'll be more difficult. And so it was the CIA themselves, the agents on the ground, telling their bosses to tell the White House to knock it off. This is not, working the way that you've planned this. And so it led to the war. And then, as we know, they wanted to continue the war. They thought it would weaken Russia. Same time it's weakening the United States and weakening Europe and weakening the poor Ukrainians. But they say, well, rightfully so, that this is costing the Russians a lot of money and is going to be somewhat destabilizing for their society to lose so many young men and all these terrible things. And isn't that great? As they put it over and over again, we have to send home Russian body bags, Russian coffins, over and over. They talk about that. and without recognizing that, the Russians, just like with W. Bush and the ABM treaty, the Russians are capable of engaging in their own side of the fight here. So they have now militarized their economy and militarized their society to a degree far beyond what it was before. So if America and the West have to face a much more militarized and militarily stronger Russia in the future, we can directly trace that to their reaction to this contest, and as it traces back. And so I think the Russians have really screwed up and miscalculated by invading. I think they had plenty of different alternatives than to do so. At best, they have a Pyrrhic victory here. They've won the war essentially at enormous cost to themselves, and including in lives and treasure, of course. But also, they've essentially absorbed now all of the even potentially pro-Russian parts of Ukraine and left behind a Ukraine that does nothing but hate them and is made of, many Russian speakers, of course, but many fewer actual ethnic Russians who identify themselves as Russian. And so, and will be led by an even more radicalized right wing, which was already pretty right wing in the first place there. So, there is not going to be, I don't think, a stable and secure peace at the end of this thing. There'll be plenty of open questions and potential for future conflict, depending on how things shake out. But at this point, I think the major risk to Ukraine, right, would be that they would lose Kharkiv and even the port city of Odessa. If the war keeps going and the Ukrainian military is completely destroyed and the Russians can then just traipse around wherever they want, then they could lose these two extremely important cities. So just as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff had recommended way back in September of 22, they should quit now while they're only this far behind, because matters just keep getting nothing but worse for them. It's a real tragedy for Ukraine, for everyone involved, but of course, especially for Ukraine. And it's, I have to say, like, even part of my mind, I know better, but even part of my mind just can't accept the cynicism of these guys. I got to question myself. Maybe they really can arm Ukraine up enough to beat the Russians. I don't know, or something. But like, no, they really are using these people just as cynically as in any of these other foreign conflicts where they back some group and then turn around and abandon them to be slaughtered, going back to the Hmong tribesmen of Vietnam or whoever. This is their game. They leave people high and dry. And so I don't know what, post-war Ukraine is going to look like, but it's going to be a real mess for a long time, and probably an American and European ward, in many ways for a long time. And then, so, I guess I would just say that, in closing, that, Victoria Nuland, who had so much to do with starting this thing, she admitted in an exit interview that, all this talk about Russia posing a threat to Europe isn't really true. I mean, they obviously have Ukraine overmatched, and they could, call up a general mobilization and a larger military force. But ultimately, do they threaten Poland and Germany? Come on. Nah, they don't. And that's Victoria Nuland talking. And then her husband, Robert Kagan, who was, Bill Kristol's writing partner on developing the doctrine of benevolent global hegemony back in the 90s, and was a major architect of the Second Iraq War, for example, a leading neoconservative ideologue. He said, Ukraine is really just not that important to the United States. It never was. It never will be, quite frankly. He said the Soviet Union controlled all of Ukraine through the whole Cold War, and we didn't care, speaking for the American National Security Council. In fact, and these are his words, not mine. He says, those are the good old days. That's not true. Soviet communism is not the good old days at all. But the point being that there was no fight between America and Russia over Ukraine then. America had stopped backing the stay-behind forces by 1958, 59. And in the scheme of things, from the point of view of Washington, D.C., who ruled those fields, just in those minds, just doesn't matter all that much. Certainly not to be worth this. And these are the architects of the war. These are the guys who said we had to expand NATO. These are the guys who said that Yanukovych wasn't fit and had to be overthrown. These are the the absolute sharpest leading edge of the American War Party, the Kagan family, saying that actually, this is all a bunch of crap. We don't have to do this at all. There's no reason to do this at all. Oh, and I'm sorry, I meant to say before, and I lost my train of thought, folks, that throughout this entire period, this is a great thing to close on. Throughout this entire period, from certainly the early Clinton years, if not the H.W. Bush years, but yes, no, even including in the H.W. Bush years, if you stretch it a little bit, you would have the leading hawks would say, of course, we have to make a special exception for Ukraine. And they had the model. The model was Austria and Finland in the Cold War. And even the hawks, even the expanders, like Richard Holbrooke and Zbigniew Brzezinski and Henry Kissinger and these others would say over and over again that, well, of course, we're going to have to make a special exception for Ukraine. And so the situation with Austria in the whole Cold War, they had no NATO troops, they had no Russian troops or Soviet troops of any kind, and they were not part of NATO or the Warsaw Pact, and they were left alone. And they had whatever degrees of trading relationships and friendly relationships with both sides, made Vienna a great place to meet and negotiate new treaties, right? And so there was plenty of recognition going all the way back to the last century that we don't want to have a contest with Russia over who dominates Ukraine. That would end terribly for Ukraine. There would probably be a war. Russia's not going to tolerate that, and Ukraine's not important enough to us to do that. So let's make a special exception. And this even goes to in 2018, in 2017, in first year of Trump, there's a guy named Ken Pollock, who is a very famous liberal war hawk from Iraq War II, extremely well-respected, very center-left foreign policy wonk from the Council on Foreign Relations, Brookings Institution, etc. One of them. And he wrote a book that was about, let's make a new security architecture for Eastern Europe that incorporates Ukraine under a new permanent Austrian-style status. But it was 2017, the height of Russiagate insanity and paranoia, which the Brookings Institute, Fiona Hill at Brookings had helped to kick off with their role in the Steele dossier's creation and everything, of course. But so his book was just a dead letter. But that goes to show that, like, this guy, literally, he's just Hillary Clinton. Ken Pollock, that's all he is Hillary Clinton. It would be like if Hillary Clinton said, let's do this. That's how, quote unquote, legitimate of a proposal it was from someone at the very highest level and very center of the centrist American foreign policy establishment. In other words, if Pollock says it was okay to do, then it should have been okay to come up with a permanent deal right then. Let's undo the errors of the recent past before this thing gets out of hand. And then they did not do that. And this was the result we got. And so, and yeah, it sucks. And I don't know what the results are going to be. There will be some positive reactions, like the move against globalism in a lot of European countries and in the United States right now. But certainly not what the war party hoped to achieve, but still, absolutely at horrible costs and never should have been done at all. And so I'm sorry for going on so long, but that's essentially the story of the book there.
Oh, that was very good. That was very good, Scott. And for, again, anybody who is provoked to pick up Scott's book as a follow-up to this presentation, go to the description box, click on the link, buy the book, share it. Thank you, Scott. I've got a question in my mind, but I'm sure Ed also has a thought or two to share. So I'll leave the floor over to Ed first before we jump into the Q&A.
Okay. Well, Scott, thank you so much. Really fascinating. And just before we go into present, you mentioned several times at the beginning and then on that Russia had some other options instead of invading. And I'm part of the group called Committee for the Republic, which meets regularly Metropolitan Club across the street from the White House. And actually, Chas Freeman, you mentioned, attends sometimes the meetings. And there's a guy, Ray McGovern, who was the senior CIA analyst under Reagan and George Bush. And he was asked, was there any other options instead of invading in 2020? And Ray McGovern said, no, Russia had no choice. So when this way, it's important to hear from you, since you said it several times. What do you think were the other options for Russia to do instead of invading in 2022.
Well, I disagree with Ray about that, and we've discussed this, me and him. In fact, one of the reasons that I was so sure there wouldn't be a war was because Ray convinced me that there wouldn't be. And that was, I think, 2/3 William Burns, the director of CIA, will see Biden through this somehow. He understands Russia enough. He can figure out a way to come to terms with Sergei Lavrov and prevent this thing from getting out of hand. And I, of course, underestimated the cynicism of the Americans. They would have preferred to have a war than to have Burns and Lavrov come to terms. And it's sickening, but true. That was part of it. The other part of it was, as Ray put it to me then, Putin's not stupid enough to do this. It would be, come at enormous cost to Russia and could take a very long time, and cost his relationship with Europe in a way, and lead to reactions of increased militarization of Europe and on and on. All these things that have come true from the reaction to the war. And so he said Putin must be taking all those things into account. And boy, would it have to be worth it for him to go that far. And as Ray said then, he didn't think that it was. So he later changed his mind about that to no, he had no choice whatsoever. But I think that's just not being creative enough. If you go back to 2018, there was a resolution in the UN Security Council, which the West obstructed, to put UN peacekeepers in there. But Putin could have said, listen, I'm going to obstruct all UN Security Council business from now on until I get my peacekeepers. And I mean it. And even now, circumstances have changed. Give me my damn peacekeepers, right? He could have said that. He didn't do that. He could have, as Errand said, he could have cut off all gas to Western Europe and said, do you hear me now? I'm playing hardball now. I'm saying in November, December of 2021, I will cut you off completely. This is how serious I am. Hey, Germany, you ought to tell Joe Biden that he better solve this problem because I'm going to make it your problem. In other words, played hardball there. And quite frankly, he could have explicitly threatened to attack. Of course, the Americans were accusing him of preparing to attack. And he said over and over again, no, I'm not. You're crazy. What are you talking about? I'm not doing that. You guys are big liars. When what he could have done was say, you're damn right I'm going to attack. These are my demands, and I mean it, and I'm as serious as I've ever been about anything. Ask my friends what that means. And then he could have made himself very clear instead of playing coy. Vladimir Putin playing coy. And I think that probably his military was saying, well, geez, boss, you don't want to just telegraph exactly what you're going to do here. So I joke in the book, I say perhaps military necessitated diplomatic incompetence. But they should have made it very clear what was at risk. But there's 195 countries in the world where they could have chose a third country to send their army in to put on a blue helmet and stand on the demarcation line in the so-called gray zone and end the civil war right then and there, put an end absolutely to that. And then again, and I'm not that creative. There's got to be 100 more. You know, David Swanson is a left-wing anti-war activist from California. And he wrote an article that said, here's 30 things Putin could have done. And some of them maybe, you know, sound kind of naive. But one of them was, why not just march a bunch of unarmed civilians in there? Like a lot of them to stand around as peacekeepers. And yeah, at some point you just change the dynamic on the ground in such a way that forces the civil war to grind to a halt and then come up with a new solution from there. And he brought this up, and it sounds silly, but that's why he brought it up. And it wouldn't necessarily fit to be in this situation. But it's an example of what people could do. And I don't know the details of this. I barely read about it. I believe it was in Latvia and Estonia. It was in 2 of the 3 Baltic countries. When they forced, and maybe some of you guys know this story better than me, I admit, but when I know that part of this is right. When they forced the Soviet army out in 1991, they did it with giant mobs of civilians singing songs, unarmed civilians, marching and singing to the Soviets, beat it, and they left. So, as Obi-Wan Kenobi said, there are alternatives to fighting. You could be creative and get what you want. And um, I think over the long term, it'll be shown that this was obviously a horrible thing for America and the West to do and for Kiev to go along with. But I think history will show that this was a mistake overall for the Russians as well.
Okay, well, it was Gorbachev at the time, and Gorbachev, no, he believed he trusted the West. Is what he said. I had the chance to talk to Gorbachev and say, "Why did you have it in writing? The thing that NATO will not move 1 inch east." And he said, "We trusted them, Gorbachev."
Right.
So this is the story. Okay, Matt, your turn.
All right, I've got a. So, in all likelihood, Trump will be meeting with Putin in Saudi Arabia very soon, provided something doesn't disrupt that. But if this happens, obviously there's a lot of potential outcomes. So I'm just curious to get your thoughts of like what would be in your mind practically the most positive hope that we could see coming out of that. And number two, there's a lot because of this. There's a lot of freakouts across Europe. Pallas, the EU policy chief, has said if anything happens, we shouldn't respect it as far as any decision made. You've got Schultz saying that we are in a state of emergency because of the potential Putin-Trump relationship. Zelensky's freaking out, talking about attacks on nuclear on Chernobyl, just to inflame the emotions a little bit in hysterics. So obviously, this is a fear in the minds of certain war hawks in Europe. So number one, what's your positive outcome? Number two, is there any capability from forces who would like to prolong the war in Europe to disrupt the outcome of something constructive?
Well, I'll take that last part first. I don't think they would dare the national governments of Europe to intervene with Donald Trump right now. They're not going to do anything. That's why they're so apoplectic, as you say, that they're relegated completely to the sidelines here. And good riddance to them. But are they going to now like try to do something to stick their thumb in his eye? I think probably they've got enough trouble and don't want that. What's the best that we can hope for? I don't know. I think that Russia's going to keep every inch of territory that they've already taken. I don't know why they would give any of it back. They are in the position of strength. They do not control all. Well, I haven't looked at the battle map in a couple of weeks, I meant, but they do not control all of Donetsk, although very close. They do control virtually 100% of Luhansk, if not 100%, but extremely close. And then the percentages are much lower in Kherson and in Zaporozhye. Now, they do have their so-called land bridge from the Donbass to Crimea and control of the southern part of the Dnieper River, which controls fresh water to Crimea. Now, that's why I think they're just not giving any of that up. Where Mariupol and Melitopol and all that little area in there between on the Azov coast, that's their so-called land bridge to control the causeway there. I mean, not the causeway, but the little it's like a little drainage ditch canal from the Dnieper River, providing fresh water to Crimea. And that was something that the previous regime had turned off, I believe, in 2014 or 2015. They had dammed that up. And it was one of the first things the Russians did when they invaded was reopen that fresh water. So the people of Crimea, they had enough fresh water for drinking water, but it had essentially destroyed their agriculture entirely by cutting them off from that water. So it gave the Russians an excuse or a reason, however you want to consider it, to control that territory from now on and not to give that back. Now, on the other hand, they control 4 provinces. Maybe they could trade away too, right? I don't know. If we're trying to bring the thing to an end. On the other hand, the Americans have already made it clear that whatever support they're willing to continue to give is extremely limited, and they are very interested in ending this thing now. So their threats to continue to arm Ukraine against Russia, and with what, more and better weapons of what kind, I don't know, supposedly to make the difference, are not going to weigh very much, right? Like Trump just and the Ukrainians, they don't have many cards to play, which I think makes it very difficult, because Trump's got to be able to claim that he has a win here somehow other than just ending the war, which is good enough for me. But, he's going to have to claim that he got something out of the Russians in this thing on behalf of the Ukrainians. I think that the thing about guaranteeing American control of the mineral rights and all of that, it's amazing, really. This is, I think, as Errand, I'll cite again, the great journalist, a Canadian-American journalist, Errand, says this is one of the things that they just hate about Donald Trump is he's just so open about it. Man, we did Iraq War II. That war was terrible, and all those people were killed, and it cost all that money, and we didn't even steal all the oil, right? Syria, we can't leave Syria. We got Conoco in there pumping gas, man. We're making money off of that. That's why we're in Syria, is for the oil. Forget the Kurds, right? You're not supposed to say that stuff. As I document in the book, the major oil companies like Chevron and others are involved in the shale oil business and would like to develop shale oil in far eastern Ukraine. And Archer Daniels Midland, Cargill, and Monsanto all have a huge interest since 2014 in trying to buy up farmland there. They forced through a law to legalize foreign companies' ownership of Ukrainian farmland. So they're trying to take over all of that. But that's all supposed to be on the down low, where you got to read some weird leftist magazine to know about that stuff. When Donald Trump's like, what we're going to do is we're going to steal their sunflowers. There's seeds in them, their sunflowers. You can sell those at 7-Eleven for a profit, right? And just people go crazy listening to somebody talk like that. Oh, there's rare earth minerals in that ground. What we're going to do is we'll give you some weapons if you give us all your rare earth minerals. And this is not non-interventionism, right? This is a form of nationalism that is different than the pretensions of liberal globalism from his predecessors. But they're the ones who already made these deals with these companies. Famously, when Victoria Nuland gave her speech in December of 2013 to Ukraine House in Washington about what's going on over there, there's a giant Chevron banner behind her because they're the big sponsors of Ukraine House, and shamelessly so. That they, run that game. And so and I guess I have to admit too, from in my own different way, that I also absolutely despise the ugliness of that. And I'm not mad that it's public. I'm mad that they do that at all. There's got to be ways for American corporations to make their way in the world without this kind of gangsterism. And if there's not, screw them. Texas natural gas companies can sell their natural gas somewhere else if they can't sell it to Germany. And Cargill can find other fields to plow if they can't get control of them without war, without supporting regimes that come to power in violent street coups and wage horrific civil wars against their own people. There's got to be a better way for us to get along. And if they can't get along, then that's what bankruptcy court is for. Capitalism does not justify imperialism at all. And I'm sorry if I missed one of your questions there. There were a couple.
That was good. Let's Paul Gardner, go for it.
Sorry. Thank you. Listen, Scott, I've only 400 pages into your book, so I didn't get it all through it. It's great. I listened to you in a previous. I'm sorry I was late earlier. I listened to one of your previous talks on, I think, Quincy Institute. One question: Partnership for Peace.
Yes.
You seem to argue it was a ruse, and I agree with you that Clinton used it as a ruse, and then at least played it up as if it was going to happen, and then expanded NATO anyway. But NATO itself, the NATO general, supported it. So was it a reality? Was it something that could have happened back in 93, 94 when it was proposed? But can it be reapplied today in the sense of some sort of peacekeeping deployments if we can actually get a ceasefire? And the third question is, if it's possible to get a ceasefire, that's not going to end the conflict. We need a whole NATO-Russia agreement. It has to move beyond a ceasefire, and in my view, reinvigorating the Partnership for Peace or some sort of new approach to European security is the way to go. And I just want to hear your comments on that, whether you agree with it or see it as is utopian or however you see the question.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for the question. So first of all, personally, I'm a total non-interventionist. I want nothing to do with all this stuff. American troops should all come home from Europe and let the European powers decide all of this. In the scheme of things, in the story I tell in the book, the point about the CSCE, it's the same thing as the OSCE. They just renamed it, but it had been around since 75. And the original proposal was essentially the same thing that they said about the Partnership for Peace, that everyone's going to all join together. It won't even be an alliance. It'll just be an arrangement. It'll be a partnership. We'll all be in it together. And so it's fine. There's no enemy to ally against, but it means that whatever problems we have in Europe, we'll all just sit at the table and hash all the stuff out. And I think that that's not utopian at all. I think the fact that you have Brent Scowcroft, who was George H.W. Bush's right-hand man and and had been a four-star general and then national security advisor, co-wrote Bush Sr.'s memoirs with him, right? A World Transformed. If that guy says, this is stupid, we shouldn't be doing this, we should do this instead, well, then, yeah, it's certainly within the realm of possibility that these policies could have been pursued instead. And again, the expanders said all along, boy, this is going to cause a real problem with Russia. Oh, well, and then they just kept doing it anyway. So the people who advised against that and proposed all these other alternatives, this was exactly why, was to try to prevent this from blowing up into a confrontation with Russia. So I think if we could go back and it was H.W. Bush and then Bill Clinton actually proposed these deals in good faith and truly meant to bring the Russians in on some sort of equal basis, anything like, well, look, I mean, America's relationship with Germany is not one of equals either, right? But we treat each other politely inside the alliance, most of the time, that they absolutely could have done that. So, and then, so what about now? Sure. I think one problem would be, I'm sorry, I might be skipping your middle question. We'll go back to it in a second. I got what Biden's got, but on the thing about, could we do something like this now? I think my only real concern with that is that it means that America would really be bound to stay even longer, because if there was no NATO, there's no American war guarantee in NATO, it would probably dissolve. There wouldn't probably be much of a threat. If we all stay together inside the Partnership for Peace, well, and I'm saying, yeah, it would not, and I don't think the Russians are coming without NATO there to stop them. I think it's NATO that's provoking them. And I think that's very clear. So then there's a opening for real peace there. But if we stay in the Partnership for Peace, then if Russia is a member of it with the rest of the European powers and America, then America has to stay inside it to balance against Russia. Otherwise, it would at least be spun, I guess, by the Western European states probably as they would be overpowered. Russia would then be the dominant power inside the group, and they wouldn't want that. So, or it would become a contest between them and Germany for who's the most powerful leader of the group, if it's not America. And that's really been the primary excuse for keeping America dominant in Europe this whole time, is that if it's not us, it'll be somebody else. It'll be the Europeans, it'll be the British, the French, the Germans, and the Russians fighting over dominance on the continent like they always do. And we're precluding that by remaining the dominant power instead. And what I would like to see is for America to just come home, and maybe they could invite Russia inside the EU, and they could, find a way to just deal with these. Again, I think that would really neutralize the aggressive posture of the Russians to a great degree without going so far as to bring them into the PFP. But certainly anything is better than the recent policy has been, which is essentially to bring our gang right up into their front yard and just say, it's just defensive. And what are you freaking out about, knowing all along that they're going to have a problem and continue to foster one? So at the very least, if they were negotiating over something like that, it would be a start of we'd be having the proper conversation about what's the future, how to keep the peace in Europe, other than, and I guess, I'm sorry, let me ramble this for one moment too, that underlying all of this stuff is the mythology of World War II. And on both sides, by the way, the American side always invokes Munich. Neville Chamberlain let Hitler get away with Czechoslovakia. Next thing you know, he goes into Poland after promising he wouldn't, right? And so that made a chump out of Chamberlain, and it proved that when a bully's a bully, you got to punch him in the nose now and not wait till later. Well, Vladimir Putin said the exact same thing in his declaration of war in 2022. He said he invoked the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Hitler-Stalin Pact, and he said Stalin tried to appease the aggressor, the fascist aggressor. And we saw that he even used that same word. Appeasement doesn't work. It only emboldens the bully. When there's a bully, you got to punch him in the nose now, not wait till it's too late. So that was how he justified attacking Ukraine, was based on this sort of, Joe Biden tells it the best. Yeah, Winston Churchill and FDR, they beat Hitler, right? Like, that's all you need to know. That's what you're supposed to do when there's a bad guy, is you just fight him. And that kind of mentality's got to get shut off somehow. We got to be able to back away from that, at least recognize that, no, we're just dealing with nation states and their power politics, and take it down from the mythological level to a more realistic one where these things can be negotiated.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think World War I is actually I think it's a mix of World War I and World War II, in fact, but World War I is still more prevalent in my mind in terms of, if you look at Ukraine, like or the Donbass region is Alsace-Lorraine, you come up with a kind of different logic to how to deal with the question. But that ended in the catastrophe too, precisely because the British and the French couldn't make a deal with Germany, and that's what we need now is a U.S. European Russian accord. And
in fact, speaking of which, it was perfectly fine when the Czech Republic and Slovakia broke apart. They said, "Hey, let's be two countries instead of one." Watch Woodrow Wilson get to decide, and then everybody was fine with it. In 2004, after the Orange Revolution, there were protests that broke out in the far east of the country, and the new government threatened war, and they shut up. And at that time, my mentor at Antiwar.com, Justin Raimondo, wrote an article. This is 21 years ago. He said, why not just let the Donbass go and be independent or rejoin Russia? Why can't this be just like the Czech Republic and Slovakia? And they just go their separate ways in peace. There's no reason. If we don't do this now, we're going to have a war later, he said. And again, because of American intervention on that issue. So, it's funny. I was accused recently by a couple of, I guess, kind of prominent commentators of just starting with Provoked. Because, see, it's the title of the book is Provoked. So somehow they just accept or just intuit that means I just worked backwards. But I didn't work backwards. I've known about this stuff. I've been covering it for 20 years as it's developed all along as this absolute slowest motion train wreck. When Raimondo was writing those articles, I was his link monkey, putting the source material in every claim that he made in those articles, proving that he was right about all of that stuff. That's how I know all this stuff is. I've been covering it all along. I've been warning against these things all along.
I've been covering it since '94, and I advocated Ukrainian neutrality way back then.
Great. I should be reading your stuff.
You look in the recent America. Well, I think I'm on the Pluralia now, or at least the latest article. But "The Dangerous Crossroads" is the book I wrote in '97.
Great.
We're arguing for a NATO Russia-Ukraine deal to prevent this war. But the war, to me, was evident from that time on, and every major thing, whether it was George Kennan, Paul Nitze sent me material. Paul Nitze wasn't even published by the Washington Post in '95, opposing NATO enlargement.
You and I have corresponded about this in the past, I believe.
Oh, that's right. It was you.
That's right.
Sorry, I'm blind.
There's only one source in the world for that. It's you. So
yeah, it is. Yeah. I have the original letter from him. I found it.
That's great. Yeah.
No, he sent me. He faxed it to me from DC, and I actually, that's a reason I haven't let it out, because it's my next book. So I had to.
Everybody chill on the ixnay on the it's-a-nay.
Yeah, it's all right. Sorry.
All right, everyone, forget what you've just heard. Sorry, Ed, what was that?
Other people. Sorry.
I would just say one thing. Well, this was all being discussed decades ago with no crystal balls, but just the act of using reason and looking at facts as they are. And somebody on this note in the chat box shared a quote from 1994 by George Soros saying, I just got to read this before we go to the next questions. Soros. It is a sort of disease when you consider yourself some sort of god, the creator of everything. But I feel comfortable about it now since I began to live it out.
Yep. And by the way, that's in from an interview he gave to The Independent. And I have a link to that article in the footnotes there. But also, in that same year, in 95, he gave an interview to Connie Brook of the New Yorker magazine, where he bragged about his role in picking Leonid Kuchma to be the winner of the election of 1994. Now, he's known as the more Russian-leaning of the candidates between he and Kravchuk now, but that was what Soros thought was his interest then, and he bragged about it. And then there's a catchy little quotable phrase there, too, where he refers to something called a real estate engagement trust or something like that. So he says, it's just like with the RETs. I make it happen with my intervention. So, and that's the election of 1994 in Ukraine. So 10 years before the Orange Revolution. And that's in the New York magazine. Connie Brook is the author.
God complexes and political power make a very dangerous combination. So I'll just say this. For those, we have a big list of people who want to pose questions, but we don't have too much time. I would say probably maybe 25 minutes. Is that okay, Scott, with you? 25 minutes?
Yes, absolutely. And I promise I'll try to keep my answers shorter. I'm the worst at...
Oh, no, context. With this type of material, context is always important. So I totally sympathize with that. But I would ask the questioners to keep the questions as short as possible. I know as short as possible, but not shorter. So, paraphrasing Einstein. Vic Hughes. I know you have twofold question, Vic, so maybe pick one of those two questions. Oh, but you're on mute. Everybody's by default on mute.
Okay. A very interesting presentation. You might find this interesting, Scott. I can't remember the exact date. It was either 98 or 99. And I was in Georgia, and I ended up, I was with some money guys from London and Wall Street looking for oil business. And I had met during the day with Saakashvili, and then that night we had a party. And I was kind of not feeling the best, so I was kind of sitting off to the side. And he and I had a good discussion, and he came over to me, and he'd spent time in Washington. So he just asked me, am I a Republican or a Democrat? And I said, no, I'm a libertarian. And he'd actually never heard about what a libertarian was. And I had this interesting thing. How do you explain libertarianism to a guy with a communist background? And I took the easy route out, and I just said, price conveys information. And he talked to me for at least a couple hours over it all. And I said, particularly when everything's been so distorted for so long, you have no idea what actually, the real price of anything should be. And that the goal of de-Sovietizing or decommunizing is let the markets work in a way that allows free flow of price information. And at the end of the conversation, this again, 98, 99, it was like 3 weeks after Shevardnadze got shot, or they tried to kill him, and the hotel had bullet holes in the front of it. I was convinced that he was going to do a libertarian revolution, and I gave him, a whole bunch of different references and stuff. Years later, I heard that he had started to do that, and it looked like he was going to lose an election, and Soros got to him. But I thought you might find that interesting. How would you explain libertarianism to a guy coming out of the communist system?
Mm-hmm. And I'm sorry, the anecdote is about Saakashvili, the later president of Georgia you're talking about?
Yes.
Uh-huh. So
he was a minor bureaucrat when I met him.
Right. Okay. So, I wonder, do you know when on the timeline, did he go to the United States and go to college after that?
Yeah, he actually, I think, went to law school, and he'd had some kind of, Beltway bandit job in D.C. And that's why he said he'd never met a libertarian.
Well, so that's interesting because there's a guy that I affectionately call the other Scott Horton, who writes for Harper's Magazine and is a professor of international law at Columbia University. And he's the author of the book, Something Secret. I'm sorry. Forgive me. Anyway, great guy. I met him before, and he is a kind of what I would consider to be like a pretty soft libertarian. I have a little bit of a grudge against him because he fell for the Russiagate hoax hard, but he had been Andrei Sakharov's lawyer. And like when in the fall of the Soviet Union, he'd gone traipsing around and I guess was pretty close to these US aid types in a lot of ways. He's the founder of the American University in Kyrgyzstan, in fact. And he told me a story one time. I used to interview him all the time because he was great on torture and stuff and Guantanamo and things like that in the Bush years. And he told me a story about how he had taught Shalikashvili at Columbia and had introduced him to Frederick Hayek and had read all about markets and how markets are supposed to work, and how he thought that this was when he became the president. He did launch this big anti-corruption drive because he really understood that you can't have actual profit and loss, real free market capitalism with all this corruption. So he started really jailing people for corruption and all these things, and had really started out as sort of like a Misesian crusader in a way. But then, of course, you know, power corrupts and all of that, and he ended up becoming the kook that he became. But he did have some kind of background in that, and I guess it was you and the other Scott Horton were the ones who taught him about this stuff.
He didn't mention that to me at all. But he said that, you know, he asked, "Are you a Republican or a Democrat?" And I'm a libertarian. He said he'd never met one. So, but again, it was hours of conversation all the way through everything. You know, as libertarians, you have to know it. But anyway, well, thank you very much. But
Sure,
it was
thank you.
interesting to see that again, you know, my contacts there said Soros got to him.
Sure.
So,
Well, look, I actually have in the book, I didn't even realize this was Tucker Carlson's father until like later on somebody pointed out that he'd been involved in Voice of America or something. And I thought, hey, wait a minute. Don't I have a footnote from him? And I do. I have a footnote from Voice of America, and it's Tucker Carlson's father, Richard Carlson, reporting on the Rose Revolution of 2003, and says it was Soros who spent tens of millions of dollars, and including bringing in roses by the truckload so that all the kooks had their roses to carry and throw when they went into the parliament and all that. The whole thing was stage managed by Soros.
well, thank you very much. Excellent presentation. I'll definitely have to get your book.
Thank you.
Roger Quintilla, are you still there? Roger, one last chance. You're on mute.
Some of
If
this,
you're
can you hear me okay?
there, you are. Hey.
Yeah, Scott, first, thanks for establishing so many historical facts about what actually happened. From my point of view as a psychologist, it helps kind of confirm some of my hunches and our hunches on the diagnosis of the people we're dealing with. I think we're dealing with a criminal enterprise, and that looking at great power competition, what we're really looking at is an attempt to conquer the world. And these people, their personalities of this core of people that are causing all this trouble are psychopaths and sociopaths. And so in terms of solutions, I think we need to bring into the perspective, what do you do when you're dealing with psychopaths? People with no conscience, people that will do things by any means necessary. In my mind, I don't trust the U.S. government at all. I don't trust the EU. I don't trust Israel. I'd like to see Russia, China, India, and some of the other countries get together, maybe BRICS, to see, to talk about what the hell to do with this bunch of criminals.
Yeah.
Was that the question or the comment from
That's
Scott?
the comment.
Okay, all right.
You can take it
Scott,
from there.
how do you want to address that, Scott?
I mean, I won't get into the other characteristics like the narcissism and some of the other things we're dealing with, but these psychological factors need to be taken into account.
Yeah, no, I agree. Look, megalomania is another one. I think, Joe Biden, please don't misinterpret this as me giving him credit in any way to say that I think he somewhat honestly thought that what he was doing was recreating the role of the greatest men of the last 100 years. Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, they whooped Hitler's butt. And that's what you're supposed to do. And when you're the president and you are called to action in history or whatever, that's what you do. And you got to give him some credit that unlike Saddam Hussein, Vladimir Putin actually is sitting on some H-bombs and has some real power, in a way that where Saddam Hussein ruled what, like 6 out of 10 cities in his own stupid country at the time, his pathetic, weak country that could never attack us in 500 years. And so in Joe Biden's mind, you know, he really is doing a heroic thing. And I think this kind of really permeates the American War Party in a way that a lot of us, we don't want to admit it because it's, it makes it sound, it's almost the same as I would talk about how stupid W. Bush was. People get mad at me because it sounds like I'm making an excuse for him. But like, you could be stupid and still have a terrible kind of a mean-spirited, premeditated plot to do something wrong, but also think that it's going to work out well when in fact it's not. You know, you and your 2 stupid friends are going to rob this bank, huh? And you think it's going to work out great and you're going to get a bunch of free money, right? But no, you're going to get, if you get out of there, it's going to be by killing a couple of people, and then the FBI is going to come after you, the feds, and you're going to get nailed, and your bank robbery career is going to suck, in fact. It's the same kind of thing with W. Bush, right? And I think there's a bit of self-righteousness there, but probably more cynicism on his part. And of course, Joe Biden was his accomplice in that too. And it wasn't just about the money, right? Or just to, you know, obviously they are kind of narcissistic and like patting themselves on the back a hell of a lot and all of that. But at the risk of sounding like an apologist, I think that there actually is a lot of self-righteousness there that is as dangerous as any profit motive or any, you know, power lust or anything that you could come up with. And you hear them talk like this all the time. If you say to them, you know, how wrong all of this is for America to be an empire and do all these things, what do they say? They go, if it wasn't us, it'd be somebody else. You prefer Russia rule the world? You prefer China rule the world? I was even told, Yana Hirsa Ali said, if America doesn't rule the world, Saudi Arabia could take it over. But see, that's completely stupid, right? Even America can't afford to take over the world, and we make money, but we're $37 trillion in debt on this fool's errand so far as it is right now. Russia and China and India and all of Europe combined still can't afford to rule the whole world. And so the multipolar world is just a reality. Even Marco Rubio is under marching orders to now accept that, you know, to blatantly and avowedly accept that fact that America is not a unipolar power.
Scott, in all due respect, I really think that we're talking about the U.S. And EU and NATO as the bad guys. I mean, in all seriousness, I mean, yes, I think you're being an apologist for what. I mean, I'm just finishing this book by Noam Chomsky and Robinson called "The Myth of American Idealism." And they document, like you do, actually, all of the evil that this bunch of criminals have conducted ever since the end of World War II. So why are we pretending that, it's just a foreign policy mistake?
Well, look, your local sheriff's department is full of a bunch of thugs who will beat a guy to death for fun. But they're not just the criminals of the town. They are the security force, and mostly they think that they're the good guys, and they got to mete out justice to those shitbirds in order to keep them in line to protect good taxpayers like you and whatever. They're as self-righteous as they could be as they act in despicable ways. So I don't think
China aren't going to conquer the world. We're the ones with 800 foreign military bases. Come on.
Yeah, but that's to hold the world together. If you read foreign
affairs,
affairs,
kidding me?
If I'm not, Jesus Christ, I'm for abolishing all governments, okay? I'm talking about what they say to each other all day.
Yeah, but you're talking about anarchism.
Where they write,
that's stupid.
They say we are preventing the world from coming apart at the seams. And you're telling me they just don't believe that at all? It's purely a hollow excuse. I mean, I don't think
I would say, look, in this case, Roger, in this case, Scott definitely is not encouraging U.S. military expansionism in any way. And I think there are certain different paradigms that you have and that Scott has, which are not going to be resolved at this moment. But overall, the need to stop World War III,
I've been reading foreign affairs since I was in 10th grade. And in every issue of foreign affairs, is we are such good people. We're doing such a wonderful thing to help all the people. That is absolutely the party line on every bit of this. And so if you're saying like, yeah, cynical liars say that, I'm saying fine, but stupid idiots believe it, and including a lot of the cynical liars themselves. Like that's, look at Iraq War II. Look at how many people in the government truly believed that, yeah, in this day and age, you just can't let a tyrant like Saddam potentially have those kinds of weapons. Yes, they believe that, and they repeat
What's going
it.
on? The propaganda is incredible. We've been so brainwashed.
Yes, agreed.
Okay.
We can all agree on that. We've all been.
But
Everyone's been very
all I'm
brainwashed.
saying
Yes.
is the brainwashing.
Don't get me wound up.
Wait a minute. Roger and everybody else, we've all read 1984. Everybody understands the propaganda is for the members of the party. No one cares if the proles believe it. It's all about making sure that the rank and file at the Ministry of Truth believe the thing that they're telling everybody else to believe. That's why they come up a lot of the times with
Believe
such
it.
ding
The
things.
politicians buy
Jesus
it.
Christ, man. Somebody hit mute on this guy, for God's sake. I'm a lot of things, but I'm not a patient man, Roger. Jesus. The fact of the matter is that government employees are probably more self-righteous than the average schmuck. And the average schmuck is extremely violent if he thinks he can hire a government employee to force his way on the world. If you want to say that, yeah, well, that's because all people are psychopaths, then okay, fine. But I think in fact, that's how, especially in American society, that's how everybody believes. That's what an opinion is. An opinion is what you think the government ought to make people do. And there's not even a step in between. So to say that they're all criminals, you're talking about 300 million Americans who think exactly the same way as their government employee overlords do.
Okay,
right.
Matt, let's move on.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have Mark, Sam, and Tony, and then a couple more. Hopefully, we'll see what we can squeeze in. So everybody, please get your questions in. Tiny questions. Mark, go. Mark Warrens. Are you still there? Mark. Okay. Next, we're going to skip Mark. Maybe Mark can't get off of mute. So Sam Phillip. Sam, I see you there. You just got to take yourself off mute. Okay, can you hear me, Sam? All right. Tony, you lucked out. Tony.
Okay.
Oh, there
Yeah, hi. You can hear me, right?
Yes,
We could, I mean, very briefly, but I think this is what's more important than some of the things being discussed, to be perfectly honest. I mean, we can get beyond, and I'm not just speaking to Scott, although, I value his contribution in his great book, but we can get beyond the U.S. slugging it out with Russia over, territories on Russia's borders, which, as Scott pointed out, and many patriots like George Kennan, this is not in America's interest. It's in the interest of only those who want war between the U.S. and Russia, as they've been pushing for. But there's far more major issues which are coming up for discussion. Remember that 1.5 hour discussion between President Trump and President Putin. President Trump said, of course, they discussed Ukraine. They discussed the Middle East. They discussed the dollar. They discussed many other important issues. And this in preparation for a summit, which is being set up, over the next few days by teams meeting in Saudi Arabia. I mean, Professor Lazansky has written about the prospects for a new Yalta. But, I mean, this is not a new Cold War. It's not going to be a Cold War meeting between, Stalin and Roosevelt and Churchill, least of all, because we're not at a new Cold War. This is going to be a new, if we achieve it, which is not, can't be taken for granted, but if we can achieve it, it's going to be new world structural agreements among sovereign nation states, not the communist bloc and, the British imperialist system. It's going to be something totally different. I mean, Lyndon LaRouche, who I worked with for many years, called for a new Treaty of Westphalia led by the US, China, Russia, and India. And really, and when Modi was in Washington a day or two ago, President Trump said that if India, China, and US get together, we can accomplish something. So, I mean, I wish I wasn't so rushed, but a lot more can be said. But this is what we should drive for. We're not in a new Cold War. We're not repeating the past. Nothing like that is true. We're capable of moving from a world of imperialisms represented by George Soros to a world of sovereign nation states that can make international agreements in the spirit of a new Treaty of Westphalia.
Well, look, I think honestly, a lot of what you say is really just, we already have that. It's the UN Charter. This,
that was the intention. Yeah, that was Roosevelt's intention.
The so-called the rules-based liberal world order, that's just the American empire overriding the international law that people actually signed up for. So I think, I'm not a big proponent of the UN. I'm much more independence-minded than that. But certainly when the Russians say, hey, we should just go by the UN Charter instead of this newfangled way you guys have come up with doing things unilaterally, fair point. Who could dismiss that? So who even needs a new treaty when we could just start, honoring the old one, at least in that respect, respecting the sovereignty of other nations and staying out of their business.
Well said. Monty.
Yeah, thank you very much. In the midst of your book, truly appreciate your work.
Thank you.
Something just struck me, though, is that I believe Putin sees something that in relationship to this war that might be overlooked by many. And I happen to be on Ray McGovern's side of this. He did not have a choice. And I think what he's recognizing is this is an existential crisis, not just for Russia, but really it's existential crisis for the world. What we're facing is an enemy within, as was pointed to at the Munich conference by we're facing an enemy within that is intent to destroy the idea of the nation state, in other words, the basis for the BRICS. And I would just point to Sergei Glavzia's comment in relationship to LaRouche that really the basic tenets of the BRICS was really founded upon the American system of political economy, not the Australian school of just free markets. In other words, the basis of it was the sovereignty of nation states. And this is really what is at risk, is because the enemy, they're not going to abide by any agreements. They're intent upon the idea of a collectivist one world government to eliminate nation states. So I think that's the blind spot insofar as a lot of the libertarian outlook. So that's just my comment.
Well, libertarians are always, we invoke Thomas Jefferson, peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations and entangling alliances with none. And so you'll find libertarians who oppose trade restrictions, but that's just because we want an open relationship with every country in the world. Not because, but you won't find us justifying American imperialism in the name of somehow, kicking open doors to American markets, or, gangsterizing countries and forcing them to hand over their resources when they can't pay the debts that, they have. This is the economic hitman model, right? Is they bribe some guy in some weak country to take on way more debt than the country can manage, but he doesn't care. He just gets a Swiss bank account out of it. It's not his liability, right? And then the country has to sign over their water resources, or sign over, their grain or whatever else, or they have to agree that from now on they won't grow any grain. They'll only import American grain, and this kind of stuff. That's not what any libertarians believe in at all. And we believe, certainly primarily in American independence, and want to respect that among all the other countries. So it's, I think it's a misnomer on the left and the right that capitalism and imperialism are synonymous. In fact, you cannot have a real rule of law and a real limited republic that protects free market property rights while you have a world empire, because you will then necessarily have an all-powerful government at home as well as abroad, which is, exactly the crisis that America suffers under right now. And so, libertarianism is all markets and no government intervention, even in the name of securing those markets, especially not overseas.
Yeah, I think I was just reacting somewhat to your comment to abolish governments, and that I think you can't have a regulatory governments in the interest of the people, the general welfare of the people, and that can be compatible with capitalism. So this idea of just abolishing governments and free markets is just not going to do it, and I think that has to be recognized.
Sure. Well, look, 90% of the time or more, I'm arguing from all other things being equal, and I live in America, and I'm an American. The USA is, as a nation state, in one form or another, is going to exist on the day I die. But I am an anarcho-capitalist. I don't think we need them. I do think, as Bill Hicks said years ago, that all governments are liars and murderers. And I was essentially reacting to the accusation or the seeming misunderstanding on the part of my questioner there, that I am justifying what these people are doing in the name of trying to make a better world, when all I was saying was that's how they justify what they're doing. It's not just Tony Soprano and his gangsters, simply just stealing. It's much more. I mean, and again, as I say, you can read it in the pages of Foreign Affairs every day. There's just as much as you could say there's psychopaths and sociopaths and narcissists and megalomaniacs or whatever. They're a bunch of self-righteous dorks too, right? Like they actually, they're government employees, most of them. They cannot internalize responsibility for the consequences of anything that they do. That's not their job. Their job is to create consequences, not deal with them. Or, if they do, it's just an excuse to do something worse. So that's part of the economics of the state. The more they fail, the more work they have to do, the better it is for them. If they solve the problems they were appointed to solve, then they'd have to go get a real job. So they don't have an interest in doing that. It's the same for police as it is for the national security state. As everybody on this call understands, America could have called off the whole damn thing after the Cold War. When the Cold War started, the Cold Warriors told the real conservatives, don't worry, this is just for the duration of the emergency, because we got to face down the droid army of the communist Red Army of the people who won't join our world order there. But once the Cold War against the communists is over, then of course we'll be a limited constitutional republic again. And there were even, as I cite at the beginning of the book, Cold War hawks like Gene Kirkpatrick, who even before the Soviet Union was gone in the fall of 1990 said, great, now we can be a normal country in a normal time. The emergency is over. We can bring all our troops home. So the idea was there from the beginning, and it truly was the vested interests that drove a lot of the policy, as I demonstrate in the book too. But then again, as I show in the book, there's Joe Biden all along too. And everything that he represents. I really think Joe Biden is like the perfect avatar for the American empire, right? Like this know-nothing, know-it-all. A lot of them know nothing, but some of them are really special in that Joe Biden way, where they really think that they're the smartest guy in the room, that they know everything there is to know. They know exactly what's going to happen. And they know that they are holding the candle, holding back the forces of darkness. And what could you ever do to talk them out of it? What could you ever do to get them to think another way about it? John McCain is another one, right? Like W. Bush, who knows what he believes or cares about? Maybe nothing. But like John McCain and Joe Biden, those guys mean most of the things that they say, right? Like that's what I think is really revealing and shows how dangerous they are. That they could not be more wrong most of the time, but they couldn't be within a million miles of recognizing that.
Evan, do you have a thought or a question?
Yeah, a quick question. I think you've already answered it, Scott. And first of all, thank you for your decades and decades of research. But you're mentioning the belief system, right? And that's what I'm curious about. It's like with all that research that you've done, all the following that you've done, it's like, what is their belief system of why they're doing it? What is their intention? and you've hinted at it, you've mentioned it, but like, is it money? Is it power? Is it land? Is it something spiritual that they're worshiping, right? That's another like side of it. So just what are some of the patterns that you've noticed with all of this, details and wars?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's always a big conspiracy of interests and a conspiracy of beliefs and all of these things. There's a great essay from about 20 years ago by a professor named Klaus Rinn called The Ideology of American Empire that I think is very interesting. There's been some study of, we talk a lot about the premillennialist dispensationalists who think that they got to help Israel force Jesus to come back and all of this crazy stuff. But there's also, I don't know that there's been too much done on this, but I've read a few things about the post-millennialists too. And they're the kind of people like the church that Hillary Clinton was raised in. And their idea is not you have to force Jesus to come back to create the kingdom on earth. It's that you have to create the kingdom on earth in order to force Jesus to come back. So here's where you get a lot of this, like what libertarians consider to be like virtually as bad as communism, right? Is like this utopian sort of progressive universalism. Someone was bringing up a great example the other day of the Clinton years. I had forgotten about this, but it's really like indicative and important. School uniforms. This was a national government initiative in the Clinton years. Maybe we should just dress all the school children alike. In other words, like there is not a thing anywhere that these people think they cannot solve. It's a common trope that among liberals, I'm from Austin, Texas. It's a common trope among liberals when I was growing up that, oh, Lyndon Johnson was such a great president with his wonderful Great Society program, but it's just too bad that the Vietnam War ruined that. But I read a really great take, I think at LouRockwell.com one time about how, no, Vietnam was absolutely part and parcel of the Great Society in every way. The exact ideology that says that we can remake the United States of America to be just like we want it to be is the exact same. Why would that stop at the water's edge? Don't you know we want to social engineer South Vietnam to be the way that we want it to be, not the way that the world is, but the way that we wish it. And we have the power, so what's stopping us? So from everything from Vietnam to school uniforms to the war in Ukraine to, all of this stuff is essentially from the center left liberals, right? Is like they're this kind of like moral imperative to always, as George Carlin would say, to always be effing with somebody, right? To always find something to do to intervene in the way that other people are. But then, you have like this Yankee Puritan influence too, where as H.L. Mencken said that to be a Yankee Puritan is to always be bothered and stuck with the unshakable feeling that somewhere someone else is happy. And you'd have to do something to destroy that. You know what I mean? You just can't. And then, Southerners like to get drunk and get into fistfights. That's a huge part of it, is like the Scotch Irish, like whoop ass. These colors don't run, boy. Come on, man, let's go. And I mean, people are really like that. I say we nuke them and take their gasoline, man. And like people they're like that. And honestly, I was raised in government school, and the way they teach you in government school is that Americans have rights because we have the Declaration of Independence and we have the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. So we have rights. The other people in the world, they don't have rights because they don't have a constitution with the Bill of Rights like we have, or at least not our same one. They don't have a Declaration of Independence like we have. So if our government mass murders, I don't know, all of them, well, like, yeah, whatever, that doesn't really count in the same way that it would count. I don't know if they do this anymore, but when I was also, when I was growing up, there'd be a plane crash somewhere, anywhere in the world. And they'd go, a plane went down, 4 Americans were killed. And they wouldn't even bother saying how many of the other people, you know what I mean? And it was like, they weren't trying to be like evil right-wing Nazi fascists. That's just the world that they see, that where America is the real world and the rest of the world are sort of like extras in our movie. Like maybe a project is something to be taken care of, to be fixed up, whether against their will. And then of course, you can't deny it's the biggest honeypot in the world. So you have all kinds of people who make a very good living telling you why it has to be this way. And that goes not just for like the arms manufacturers, but think about like the people at the staff of the think tanks and stuff. I don't know exactly like what's the going rate, but if you are like a staff professional at the Brookings Institute or the Council on Foreign Relations or one of these things, working for Bill Kristol at the Foreign Policy Initiative or whatever, you can make $250,000 a year or something, right? Like this is or maybe more, maybe $500,000 a year. I saw on Republican data or whatever, all this new stuff from USAID coming out, that the National Democratic Institute has a housing allowance. If you work for the NDI, this is all taxpayer money, but maybe that's why Michael McFaul was bragging that he lives in this giant mansion in the most expensive part of San Francisco. It's because he's a welfare queen in a Cadillac. As long as he promises that he's expanding democracy to Eastern Europe, he gets everything he wants for free. And so, but another great example. You think Michael McFaul doesn't believe every lie that comes pouring out of his mouth? You know what I mean? He's one of the most self-righteous of them all. So that's the way it goes.
Thank you. That's great. Lots of different beliefs there, that's for sure.
Yeah, always.
And there's a reason why Hollywood or the CIA pours so much money into Hollywood and has for so many decades, because it contributes back to these big sacred myths about ourselves that get us drunk on our own awesomeness. And we don't pay attention to the bombs that we've just dropped, killing lives all over the world as a consequence. But thank you, Scott.
I mentioned that to a friend the other day, and he had just absolutely never heard of that. And so it's important to mention, if people, I guess everyone here is pretty educated on these things, but like some people just don't know. There's entire books and books and books, 3 or 4 or 5 really great books all about this. And even, God, I'm blanking on the guy's name, but there's a partnership, these 2 journalists who work together. And I guess it's been a while since I've seen one of their emails, but I'm on their email list that they do. Oh, it's Tom Secker is one of them. Tom Secker is a great expert on this, Secker. He and his buddy. And but there's like 3 or 4 really great books about this, about how not just the military, but the CIA, they exert incredible control over Hollywood. They doctor scripts. They'll come up with anything. Did you know that Forrest Gump had a bunch of really hardcore anti-Vietnam War stuff in it, and they just scrubbed it all out? Now it's just, always saves Bubba and whatever. There's a couple of lines about, geez, I wondered why we were so far from home getting blowed up or whatever, but there's very little of that because they scrubbed it all out. And in fact, there's this great article I read that was like Tom Hanks, the CIA asset, about how, I don't know if that's really true, but like in practice it is, because he's part of so many of these propaganda movies that build up militarism in this way. And he's got such that like perfect sort of innocent beta male baby face type, thing that make people trust him and believe in him. He makes a great like all-American boy hero at war kind of character, and they use him a lot.
And wholesome, yeah.
Yep.
No, and grooming the next generation of young idiot CIA analysts for the future who get a little bit too excited on this romantic spin. But all that to say, we've hit the top of the second hour, and I mean, you very much appreciate you sharing today, and I appreciate everybody taking part in this process. Look, I mean, Ed, I'm going to leave it to you to end. Any final words, parting words you want to share?
Well, first of all, Scott brought the record. We never met for over 2 hours. Usually our sessions are hour and a half. So he broke the record, but it was really a great time. Good, and especially it's on the eve of historical events coming up practically tomorrow, which maybe everything will somehow we'll start moving toward a better future. Scott, thank you so much. I don't know if you will accept this, but let me offer you to be an honorary professor of American University in Moscow, this title. If you accept, it'll be great. And we will promote, you will continue to do that. No, as I said, we are just now being absorbed in a major project run by Italians, and they just added the 5th language, they added Arabic. And of course, all our future students, I don't know how many we'll get, maybe, with Pluralia, we definitely will be over 1,000, maybe more. I will force everyone to read your book, otherwise they wouldn't pass the test. So, in terms of what to do, just want to say that we worked so hard in the 90s after collapse of the Soviet Union, and on 93 we brought a large Ukrainian delegation to Washington, and from Russia. And we had meeting on Capitol Hill. And this is when we started talking about how those three countries can live together in peace, and not just in peace, but there actually will be also capitalism for everyone. And then there were, after that, there was a party in Congress first, then the party in Russian embassy, then Ukrainian embassy. We were all friends. And the guy who came from Ukraine was head of the two committees, Foreign Affairs and Foreign Policy, Vladimir Mukhin. I'm still in touch with him, by the way. He's no longer in the parliament, rather, but he's professor of physics as well. And at that time, he went into politics. And he, in 93, what he, Perry, which you mentioned, and the Ukrainian Secretary of Defense, and Russian Secretary of Defense, they planted friendship tree. Can you imagine? In Kiev, they went to Kiev, they planted friendship tree. The three countries working together. This was the time. At that time, Ukraine still was in the 1991 borders. Okay, if this would continue, if these ideas that we discussed would really implemented, Ukraine will stay it was the same, including Crimea, by the way. And it was ruined by the party of war. At some point, I think we have to have a Nuremberg 2.0 trial and put on the bench all of those who are responsible for this tragedy, because so many people were killed. It's horrible, especially for someone like me who was born in Ukraine, then moved to Russia, Moscow, and then to America. So I wanted those three countries to be really working together for the better kind. But forces who are against us are at this point still more powerful. Who knows? Maybe Trump can change it. Well, thank you again, everyone.
Yeah, and hopefully one of these upcoming roundtables that we have can be on the topic of our commentaries on the Nuremberg trials 2.0 that have just begun. Hopefully, so we'll see. Thank you so much, Scott, and thank you, Ed, and thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.